Hey, welcome back. We are here for Unit 6 with AP Psych. This is going to be human development across the lifespan. And so what I'm going to try to do for this topic is break down a couple of videos. It will not be all together like the last one for finishing Unit 5, so that video turned out to be a little long anyways. So this one will be shorter. I'll just do a couple topics at a time, and then I'll close the video, pick it up with a new topic. But again, this is human development across the lifespan. We're continuing on with our remote learning. Sadly, I wish we were doing this in the classroom, as I think it would be a lot more entertaining, but we do what we can, and this is what we have to work with. So this unit is basically about birth to death. There are some topics that are more important than others. I actually would say that the physical development side of this unit takes a backseat to other components, such as your development of morality and your social and identity development, as well as your cognitive development. So that will probably be the most important lesson, and that's not what this one's going to be on. This one is basically just what happens structurally, physically from birth to early childhood. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Initially, when you're created, what's formed is known as a zygote, and this is a cell. This is a sperm and egg cell that have been unionized here, and this begins what's known as the prenatal time period of development, which is 9 months from conception to birth. And so the prenatal time period has 3 separate stages and how they're identified. You'll see some text in a minute, but structurally, this is what you're looking at. So you have the first stage known as the germinal stage. Then we got the next stage, embryonic, and then lastly, the longest stage of prenatal development, which is the fetal stage. So here you can reference some imagery and some dates as to how long these typically last. What we have first is the germinal stage. So this is the course of prenatal development. This is the first 2 weeks after conception of the zygote. And during this time, the most important development is the structural formation of the placenta, which is what allows nourishment and oxygen, as well as waste, to pass back and forth between the growing child or zygote, initially fetus, and then the mother. And so the placenta is this special structure that is like a highway system. It allows two-way communication, so oxygen and nourishment will pass into the fetus from the mother's bloodstream, and also body waste from then the developing fetus will actually be removed through the placenta as well, and then through the mother. And so that is the first 2 weeks after conception, and that's the first stage of prenatal development. Secondly, we have the embryonic stage. And so now we're talking about 2 weeks until the end of the second month. And so during this stage, you have the transition from being called a zygote to now the embryo. And during the embryonic stage, you're going to have the beginning of some organ formation. Sadly, most miscarriages actually occur in this stage, and they're not always known to the expecting mothers or to the pregnant mothers. It's during this stage that, like I said, vital organ growth begins. So you'll start to get a heartbeat during this stage, and this is something that can be detected in working with an OBGYN and doing ultrasounds. But yeah, most miscarriages occur in this stage. And then lastly, we have the fetal stage. This is the third and final stage, prenatal development. So now we're talking from about 9 weeks until the end of the pregnancy, 9 months. And so we have 2 months until birth, making up the fetal stage. During this time, you're going to start to have the transition to being called a fetus rather than formerly a zygote or embryo. Now we are officially in the fetal status. And so you're going to have formation of muscle tissues and bones. The organism does become the fetus, like I said. This is when physical movements will also begin. So the child will begin to move around some. There'll be some obvious physical movement as you get further along throughout the prenatal development. But skeletal structures here are also hardening. Now, because this is 2020 and we live in an age where we have heightened technology and various increases, there is something called the threshold of viability, also known as the age of viability, which is how young a child could be born premature and still survive in the event of that premature birth. And so in this day and age, a child can be born at as young as 23 weeks to 26 weeks and have somewhat decent survival odds. Children that are born earlier than 23 weeks are not typically expected to survive, sad to say. So the threshold for viability is around 23 to 26 weeks. Now, if you're in a country that has access to things like prenatal health care and prenatal screenings and lots of technology, obviously, there are situations where babies have survived likely earlier than this, but in terms of the norm, you don't typically see babies that are born earlier than this with a high expectation of survival. All right, so here's just an interesting diagram I found years ago, basically about fetal development. And what actually does happen is fetal development slows down. So if you were to grow after you were born at the same rate of growth as you were growing in the womb, you would end up being a 200-pound baby. But thankfully, that's not what happens. So if you really think about it, you start from nothing, a small little cell, and then you turn into a child, a fetus, a baby in 9 months. That's a lot of development taking place during that time. And so luckily that rate doesn't continue, and then life really slows down for you so that you don't become a 200-pound baby, because obviously your body would not be able to support that. Let's take a moment and talk about teratogens. Teratogens are harmful agents to the prenatal environment. So these are things that are actually going to harm you before you actually exist outside the womb. So that makes them pretty dangerous. Cigarette smoke is an example. Infections and viruses are an example. Right now we're at a time of COVID-19, and it is to be determined still if that's going to have any effect, I would imagine, on the prenatal environment. It's certainly going to cause some caution and alarm for people, as they wouldn't want to expose their fetus developing to viruses or in other instances that are not COVID-19, different bacteria. It's just one of those things that anything negative here that could impact the prenatal environment is classified as a teratogen. And depending on your environment, some of these things could be significantly worse than others. In America, we have access to lots of prenatal health care, prenatal screenings. There's been lots of society kind of moving away from, even having cigarettes and public smoking. And so while there are some measures in place that are not necessarily for that, they kind of indirectly do relate. And so, not everybody around the world is going to be that lucky. Obviously, the prenatal environment is going to look different depending on your geographic location. So it is something to think about. But you can see some more examples here of different environmental factors that could impact the prenatal development, your nutrition in general. Imagine you're growing up in a country that is already dealing with starvation and malnourishment, and somehow, you can barely feed yourself. And then, you're a pregnant woman in this country. You got to figure out, how are you feeding two instead of one? So there can be complications there. You've got drug use. Drugs are not filtered through the placenta. And so if a pregnant woman is using drugs, whether that is actual drugs and alcohol or whatever it ends up being, pills, anything that's impacting her bloodstream is going to go to the fetus. And so that is what the placenta does. It is a two-way street, and it does not filter out drug use. And so we actually have one of the largest contributors to intellectual disabilities is actually FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a big risk that somebody runs if they use drugs and alcohol in creating a life that's going to be born with congenital problems. So there's maternal illness, there's prenatal health care as well. Pretty much explained all those, so let's keep going. So how would you actually measure what a healthy newborn is going to do? How do you know if you have the newborn who's growing in a healthy way? And so there are actually some standard reflexes that are classified to say that if this occurs, then that baby is considered to be growing at a healthy rate and as a healthy child. So some of these are common sense based on the language, some are not. So let's just look at a couple of them. We have the rooting reflex, which is a baby's tendency when touched on the cheek to open and search for a nipple. And so obviously I should precede this with saying you should really never put your hands on someone's baby, especially if You don't have the permission to touch someone's baby, but you see in society when a baby is brought out in front of people who have never encountered it before, everybody wants to get real handsy and poke the baby and like try to touch their fingers and their feet. And if you've never seen that, then this probably doesn't sound very familiar to you, but I promise you one day that will be the case. And so the rooting reflex is just saying that a baby will have a tendency as a reflexive developmental tendency to search for nourishment. And so if you're to touch the baby literally on the cheek over here, that baby is going to be looking to open its mouth and search for a nipple or a bottle for nourishment. Okay, another reflex is known as the Moro Reflex. And what happens here is in regards to startling a baby, and obviously you would not want to purposely startle a baby either, but if a baby was startled, a baby that is healthily developing will thrust out its arms and backs, and its backs. We got one back. But in doing this, you thrust out your arms and arch your back, and this is the healthy reflex being associated with being startled as a baby. So again, that is the Moro Reflex. And then you have the tonic neck reflex. So if a baby is on its back with its head turned to the side, the baby would make the on guard position with its arms. So you can kind of see it referenced here. And again, this is just another one of the reflexes associated with healthy development. And lastly, there's a couple more. These I'm not really going to focus on because you can read them. I would say they're a little bit less important since they are self-defining, but you will definitely see this stuff occur. Again, if you get the okay and all clear to actually put your hands on someone's child, you can definitely determine the grasping reflex just by putting your finger in their palm or poking their palm, and the baby's fist will clench closed. So, yeah, that's all I got to say about those. And then what about in the environment? How does the environment and motor development actually impact childhood? What do you see? So there's really two forms of motor development and how physical activity is kind of being coordinated, how the body is preparing for physical activities and movement. And so these two trends of development are called the cephalocaudal trend, which is when you are gaining control over your head to your feet. So babies will actually gain control over their head first, and then that control kind of moves down the body. So from head to foot. And then proximodistal trend, which is having control of the center of your body first and then outwards. So babies will get control over their head and then over their torso area much faster than they will their limbs, hands and feet. Initially, when babies start moving around, if you watch closely, you will actually see how it seems like they're kind of swinging around a lot of their body's weight. And that's mostly because they've got control of the center of their body first. As they develop and get older, then they can start to use their, their periphery really more to their advantage. So, their limbs, their hands and their feet. They don't have to necessarily use all of that weight of their torso. And so that is the proximodistal trend of childhood development. As you get older, parents are often trying to compare, especially first-time parents, I would say, because there's really a lot of literature here, but they get concerned with what are called developmental norms, which is like, oh, why is my kid not doing this by a certain age? Why are they not talking yet? Why are they not moving around? Why are they not crawling? And so developmental norms can be a little scary, I would imagine, as a parent, just because you're worried about your kid being off pace and worried like, oh, something's wrong, my kid's not developing. But these are just guidelines. It's not the average for everyone. It's median ages. And so as kids get older, initially that physical maturation is really important because there's so many structural things that are happening that are going to contribute more in early childhood to exploring your environment and physical activity. But as you get older and later childhood years, experiences start to really become more important, pretty much around the time of post-puberty, so late childhood. A couple of ways that people are generally studied here. This is a little out of order, maybe, but ultimately you will be asked about this from this unit at some point. So there's two different types of groups. You have what's called the longitudinal study and then the cross-sectional study. Longitudinal study means it's a long study. You've got one group studied over a long period of time. And so you might take a group of people and they're studied when they're 5 years old and 8 years old and 11 years old and then 14 and 17. It's one group who gets studied over that long period of time, hence the long study or longitudinal study. Cross-sectional studies are going to be when you have people of different ages who are compared at one single point in time. If I wanted to compare generations, for example, if I wanted to compare the baby boomers and the millennials and Gen Z and Gen X and Gen Y, whatever it needs to be. These are groups of people at different ages who all get compared at one single point in time. Again, there's a lot of references right now to COVID-19. So there's been a lot of stuff in the news talking about how certain demographics, certain generations of people are making decisions to not social distance. Often it's being blamed on millennials, which is not true because a lot of millennials are now my age, born sometime between 1980 and 1994 or 1995. And those people are working from home in their jobs. They're not out there trying to not socially distance themselves. They're not trying to party and get in big groups of people. I'm sure some people are, but yeah, so cross-sectional studies is when you see these reports and you have people from baby boomer and older generations saying, we made different sacrifices. Why can't these younger generations do those as well? So you're comparing people at different times. Okay. About 2 or 3 more points to make, and then this video is over. So there is a concern in early childhood with temperament. This is a word you probably have never thought about, really. And maybe if it applies to like your dog, what's the temperament of a dog? What's their mood like? What's their activity level like? How are they responding emotionally? There's different levels of childhood temperament, and luckily they're pretty self-explanatory. You can see 2 different studies here, one from Jerome Kagan and one from Chess and Thomas. But I'm just going to focus on saying, like, you have 3 different childhood temperaments: the easy, the difficult, and the slow to warm up, and they're exactly what they sound like. So an easy child is a child who's got a positive mood. They adapt to new things like toilet training, bedtimes, rules and regulations. They adapt easily with that. A difficult child is really the opposite. They're really going to resist change. Changes to their everyday existence is going to be pretty tough. Their reactions are often going to be negative to those things. And then the slow to warm up child is really some mix of the in between. It's basically kids that have a low mood intensity, so they're not super active. They have a low level of activity, maybe a little on the negative side, but they are eventually going to come around. And so that's temperament in a nutshell. And then attachment is another big part here. So separation anxiety really is going to peak between children and their mothers, or it could be their father as well. It's the primary caregiver. It's usually the mother. But separation anxiety peaks around a little over a year, up to about a year and a half. And this is at least the first moment of distress, separation anxiety, when an infant is feeling this disattachment from, again, their primary caregiver. And there has been a lot of research into attachment. I'm actually going to tell you about one of the most famous studies in psychology. It's about contact comfort. It comes from a guy named Harry Harlow, and it's involving the rhesus monkeys. So you may have been wondering, why is there that rhesus monkey picture on the wall of my room? Well, it's because of this. And so originally there was a proposal about attachment, theory of attachment, very biological in nature. If I asked you to think about, because you're not parents, so and I'm not either, but asking you, if you have a pet, okay, raise your hand in class. Do you know who your pet's favorite person is? Most people say yes. It's my mom, it's me, it's my dad. It's got to be somebody in your household. But why? Why is that your pet's favorite person? And so we are kind of programmed with taking care of animals. Animals are really programmed as well to favor that person that gives them a biological basis for attachment. Whoever's feeding your dog, whoever lets your dog outside to go to the bathroom, those are pretty critical biological components. Those people become the favorite for that organism. And so this is how attachment had often been viewed. Babies are programmed to emit certain behaviors. They smile, they make noises, they cry. And what do adults do? Oh, they give attention to the baby. If a baby's crying, somebody's going to show up. And so this is a biological basement for attachment, but it's not the only type of attachment. And in fact, there's a famous study here, and I would encourage you to watch a video on YouTube. It's about 5 minutes. Just do a search for Harry Harlow contact comfort. But what's happening with contact comfort, and it really will probably explain better, but it's the idea that biological attachment is not the only type of attachment that an organism would seek. In his example with the rhesus monkeys, he takes these monkeys in a moment of being frightened and in a moment of uncertainty and unfamiliarity with their environment. One of the things they're actively seeking out is not actually biological reinforcement, but they're seeking out contact comfort. They want to feel something that gives them a sense of security, and they bond with that feeling. And it's the way that they would want to curl up next to a soft blanket or a cloth mother, so to speak. When you watch the video, you'll see what I'm talking about. But it's actually really fascinating, and I hope that you'll take a look at it and enjoy it. And so that's Harry Harlow. One of the ways of thinking about this is Harry Harlow conducts hairy studies with rhesus monkeys. So hairy monkeys, Harry Harlow, you just kind of use play on words and help remember what this one's about. It's really a fascinating study, and I recommend checking it out. Okay, final thing to share about attachment, and then we're all done, also comes from another famous researcher. Her name was Mary Ainsworth. And Mary Ainsworth conducts an experiment which has been labeled the strange situation procedure, basically exposing infants and then their mothers to different tests involving separation and then reunification to see what level of attachment they have. And so there's 3 types of attachment that come from this, and then one that's added later on by others, but this is back in 1970. And basically the idea is you put an infant in a room with their mother and measure what are they doing, and then you separate the infant from their mothers. And so how do the infants respond? And then how do they respond when the mothers are brought back in? So if you look at this chart, you can kind of see how it's broken down for you. And I'm going to use that instead of having to explain it and confuse you with extra length here. But a secure attachment is the most favorable attachment. This is what you would want in an ideal world. And these attachments actually are not only to explain babies, but they will also be used later to explain social behavior among adults. And so that, I believe, is going to conclude this first lesson of Unit 6 on human development. Here's 2 videos I would recommend watching, and again, you have to just do a search for them, but you will learn both about the marshmallow experiment of instant gratification from Walter Mischel, and then Harry Harlow's contact comfort. So take a look at those, and as always, stay healthy, and I'll see you next time. Adios.